It was 100 years ago today that the American composer Edward MacDowell passed away. And I think not enough people have really immersed themselves into his music and his influence. And we'll use this excuse, this 100-year excuse, to dig far deeper into the life and the work of Edward MacDowell. And who better to do that than a woman who has won all kinds of awards for her artistry and for her work in radio. Virginia Eskin was recently the recipient of a Clarion Award from the Association for Women in Communications just this year for her best radio documentary series, a 13-program radio series sponsored by Northeastern and WFMT called First Ladies of Music. Virginia Eskin is here at our piano right now, and we'll begin with music by Edward MacDowell. This is his Träumerei in A-flat from the Virtuoso Etudes. A very nice example of the natural flow, the romantic flow that came from Edward MacDowell, the American composer. Träumerei in A-flat from the Virtuoso Etudes by MacDowell. And that was live from our Fraser Performance Studio. Virginia Eskin, welcome.
Thank you, Cathy.
You make the piano sound gorgeous.
Not a hard thing to do.
Edward MacDowell, so we're going to really immerse ourselves for a while in him.
All right. Did you play him as a girl growing up?
No, just the little pieces, some of the little pieces, but not many.
I think he suffers from the age-old insecurity complex that Americans have, and it carries over really till now. I played his concerto in Athens a couple years ago, and it was required by the sponsor. And the Greek orchestra looked as though, I had brought dog meat to the rehearsal. But after we ran through it, they all came up, and said, "Oh, good piece, good piece." And I've been having a good time playing it locally. I played it with the Civic, played it up in New Hampshire. I'm playing it in Russia in the spring. I'm playing it at Castle, and I'm going to shove MacDowell down those Europeans' throats because, and that's what I wanted to bring to you and your listeners, there's our incredible strength in those little pieces. Was it Lincoln who said, "I don't have time to write a long speech"? When you write a little thing, it's always much trickier because the facets have to be more brilliant. And those little pieces that Schumann wrote taught us that. And we know that MacDowell went to Germany to study. He comes from New York, and his mother was very ambitious for him. He started off as a very fine painter. In fact, he was sketching a professor at the Paris Conservatoire and making sort of a caricature, and the teacher yanked the sketch away and said, "Aha! You know, I'm going to fix your red wagon." And he actually mated him up with a very good artist. So that tells us that he had two very large talents at the age of 15. He decides to be a pianist. He's taken then to RAF.
Joachim Raff.
Exactly, in Germany. And that eventually leads to an introduction to Liszt. Now, these are big boys. This is, a little American.
This is pretty serious.
Yep. And he suffers, though, from a sort of he doesn't believe in himself. And it's a good reason, because he's not well prepared. And Raff outs him, catches him sort of making up stuff. So they really tweak him, and eventually his wife, she comes to Germany, wants to study with Clara Schumann. That doesn't work out. She meets Edward. And without her, he would just, I think, have melted into the moss. But she organizes him. She has some family money. And eventually he comes back to New York. That doesn't end well because he's too familiar with the students. And that's very touching because he's being an American. At Columbia, he wants a seminar sort of thing. But the president said, "No, we want the Plato ideal where you stand and deliver. We don't want you talking to the students." And they fire him.
Well, this must have been, at this time, there was such a strong European influence in music. This must have been a hard
sell.
Yeah.
It was.
And I do remember you mentioned this interest in small pieces. I do remember reading that he once referred to sonata form in his teaching. He urged his students not to write big, huge, long-winded pieces. He even once referred to the sonata form as an iron bed. He said, you're much better off working something small and making it work, just as you said, than trying to elaborate too much on something large.
Well, because unless you're Mahler or Bruckner, or you have huge schema, and he seems to have realized that. That's a very good point that you make. So he scoped down, and of course he has to make a living, and he's very popular, though, in his day. He plays with
American sounding?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It sounds like American Grieg. There's a lot of Mendelssohn. It's a lot of fun to play. It lays under the hands very well, unlike Brahms. Mm-hmm. And I had a good time making comparisons recently for seminars of the concerto, because it's in D minor, like the Brahms D minor. There's an 8-year difference between the two of them. He copies Brahms, wantonly. Broken field running octaves, those huge trills, clarion call, where'd he get that idea? But there's nothing wrong with that. All disciplines tend to look back. You have to look forward. You have to look back, and you sometimes resorb or reinvent or rejig or echo. There's all kinds of words. But I'd like to just play these little things, and I think you'll be charmed with the similarities.
Here is a good example of Schumann writing in a small form in the way that MacDowell liked to do. From his forest scenes, the Waldszenen, this is Elf. Virginia Eskin conjuring up the magic of Robert Schumann's forests. From his forest scenes, that's Schumann's Elf. And as we're really gazing on the sound and the meaning of Edward MacDowell's music, here is Edward MacDowell's Elfin Dance. It's one of the Virtuoso Etudes by the American composer Edward MacDowell, who we're considering today with Virginia Eskin from his Opus 46 set of Etudes. That's the Elfin dance. These elves really were an inspiration to the romantic masters of the time. Here's another good example. Virginia has brought, also from the Forest Scenes, Opus 82 of Robert Schumann, Solitary Blooms. Solitary Blooms from the Forest Scenes of Robert Schumann with Virginia Eskin live in our Fraser Performance Studio. And so, an eye for an eye, a flower for a flower. Here is Edward MacDowell's take on a beautiful flower. He did love them. This is Bluette, Opus 46, number 8. That's the Opus 46 number 8 piece by Edward MacDowell called Bluette, named after a flower, one of his Virtuoso Etudes, pieces that are not often heard. And Edward MacDowell died just 100 years ago today, so we're looking into him a little more closely and getting to know some of these gorgeous miniatures played for us today by Virginia Eskin. They are beautifully crafted, these little pieces. I wonder when he was teaching what he was after from his students as far as the craft was concerned. Was he very strict about how to write?
You know, there are no diaries, and the life that you gather he was leading, he's full of disappointment. There's a lot of setbacks, and even when he is introduced to Liszt, he's kind of full of braggadocio, and Liszt, says, "Bring me something big." And what are you working on? And he's supposed to have said also to Raff, "Oh, I'm working on a concerto." And so they said, "Well, where is it?" And I think what happened was he didn't have the kind of success that he maybe thought was coming to him. And then when he comes back to New York and is teaching at Columbia, things start to unravel. And he's having a lot of success with the concerto, and Damrosch and some conductors took on the large overtures because he loved Arthurian legends. And not for nothing that Carreño, the concerto's dedicated to her. And
she was a singer and a pianist, amazing.
Yes, and a composer.
Carreño from Venezuela.
Exactly.
One of the great divas of the keyboard.
Exactly.
And he studied
Virtuoso.
Yeah.
Big chest, big pipes. And she also, in notes, I think they're coming up against the idea there's this terrible sort of discrimination that's happening already in 1900 in America. If it's from Germany or from Europe, it's good. If it's American, and she was considering herself American, at that time, it's inferior. There's another way of putting it. People say it's second-rank music. I remember one time saying to a manager, "Why do you keep playing all this fourth and fifth-rate European music?" It was at a festival nearby here. When you could have second-rate American music. And he looked at me like I was nuts. But
it's a good question.
Don't you feel as a pianist, it's not that it's easy to play Liszt or Beethoven, but it's all right there, Cathy. Come on. It doesn't take rocket science to make it work. This kind of music does require special handling. You can't just take it for granted. And so then that's why it's been relegated to children or teaching pieces. That's very unfair, actually, because I think it requires more from a pianist to put this kind of music across. I feel it in my fingers, and my hands sort of inform me. They're almost like my little detectives, when I play something by Gottschalk, and I think to myself, wait a minute, that's out of the fantasy impromptu of Chopin, the riff or the patterning. Mm-hmm. And jazz pianists, of course, know that because everything is patterns there, because they don't have melody per se.
Well, it's a good point that you make, that it's special handling. And it's only right for a composer who has written so much fascinating music that it be presented at its very best. And
I don't think it's enjoyed that. Stop and think, in our lifetime, the only pianists who played MacDowell's music, Andre Watts and Van Cliburn, and passingly. And that also brings it back to the general sloth that pervades the music industry. You have to find a conductor who's gutsy and frisky, and willing to learn the score. And the music business constantly boxes us in and says, just play some old dead men that we know, don't make trouble.
Right.
And
well, you're always one for making trouble, and we appreciate that. Well, so now what you're going to do is actually put Franz and Edward together. Franz Liszt, this Waldesrauschen is a very important piece. In fact, I think it's rather explosive for the piano, and it is a good example of how Franz Liszt changed the way the piano is played. And Virginia Eskin will play this. It's often translated as Forest Murmurs by Franz Liszt. After that, we'll hear some MacDowell. We're live from our Fraser Performance Studio with Virginia Eskin. Franz Liszt. A murmur for Franz Liszt can become something fairly epic, but it returns back to its original state. Forest Murmurs, Waldesrauschen by Franz Liszt. We're live with Virginia Eskin today, and we're considering Edward MacDowell today, who played for Franz Liszt and who was a contemporary of Franz Liszt, but an American one. Here now is something from Edward MacDowell's Woodland Sketches. This is Will o' the Wisp, Opus 51. Virginia Eskin playing music of Edward MacDowell. That's from the Woodland Sketches, Will o' the Wisp. He uses these evocative little tricks to conjure up this twinkle and this atmosphere. And you've been comparing him to Franz Liszt. You've got Gnomenreigen with you. What will we hear in Gnomenreigen that might be similar to MacDowell's music?
I think what he does is a lot of tremolos, and in the fuffolet, it's all.
Right.
And I think that comes from, when you want to scare somebody as a child, you go.
Right.
It's sort of like
those
witchy,
goosebumps
witchy, witchy.
that appear,
Yeah.
right?
And when you want to, gnomes, trolls, spiders, bugs, all these sort of romantic German. Grimm. It's really Grimm's. It's. I don't know why you'd want to scare a child when they're going to bed, but the idea you better go to sleep or the bugs and the gnomes and stuff will get you. This is an age-old trick.
Yes, it is. It's almost like an entrance into the dream world.
It is
offering you a door in.
That's absolutely true. Caspar Weinreich, those weird paintings, that are all dark and smoky and scary. Mm-hmm. Well. This music is supposed to be like that.
Okay. Well, we'll stay in F sharp minor, and we'll go to Franz Liszt's music, more tremoloing, coming directly from Virginia Eskin. This is Liszt's Gnomenreigen. Now, there is music from the sort of dark recesses of perhaps the forests in Liszt's mind, the gnomes that live in those forests. And Virginia Eskin is playing for us. That's Gnomenreigen by Liszt. And Virginia, of course, if you're thinking of the forests and the evocative things that might live in them, and you hear Liszt conjuring those up, then you hear Edward MacDowell conjuring them up. The one difference is that one is a New England forest, I suppose, and the other might be the Black Forest or something. But is there as a pianist, what is the difference between MacDowell and Liszt?
Well, Liszt is a little fiendish, but MacDowell is equally difficult because sometimes he repeats. Liszt is already, pushing the envelope chromatically, so every bar it changes. I've always been drawn to the darker side of Liszt. The last thing he composed was a beautiful viola romance. And then do you know those oubliés, waltz oubliés? Oh, they're beautiful. And I like that kind of dark, mystical part of Liszt, the music you hear in his symphony.
Well, that might be it that I'm noticing perhaps with MacDowell. There does seem to be a more psychological quality to Liszt's music than to MacDowell.
You mean negatives?
No,
or sort
not
of
negative,
like crazed, sort of?
That there is some a sense of mirroring some deep inner quality of the mind that maybe isn't being mirrored in MacDowell's music. That MacDowell's is more a mirror of something more natural.
Uh-huh. That's interesting because I think MacDowell actually mentally unraveled.
He did unravel, and
yes,
did he end up in an institution for some time?
Well, it's a little cloudy. His wife yanked him up here, and he lived in Boston on Chestnut Street for a little while, and then he was advised to drink raw cow's milk. So where are they going to get that? So they'd heard there was a farm in Peterborough, New Hampshire. So she drags him up there and builds him a very beautiful log cabin, which to this day is the centerpiece of the MacDowell colony. And he faced the log cabin towards Mount Monadnock. And every day he would go into his log cabin studio and compose more and more of these little elfy, gnome, trolly pieces. So he felt safe in those bookends. You're right, the large, but it's ironic because he actually was unraveling mentally. Liszt had a fantastic long life, several wives, and God, he was an incredible teacher and became even an abbé at the end. He dabbled in religion and covered in wens, and so he kept his wits about him, whereas poor MacDowell was a much more delicate person in every regard. And the whole staggering phenomenon, though, of the MacDowell colony, just look at that little list.
This is a list of
just
those
some Americans
who've gone
there,
colony.
Not to mention all the painters and the writers.
Sure, Libby Larson, Charles Warren,
everybody.
Del Tredici, Aaron J. Kernis, of course,
It's a
Aaron
who's who.
Copland, Bernstein, Virgil Thompson, so it was. But it's a very generous thing. I know that his wife was involved in this too.
They bought land
to create this space for thinkers and
he
music
was
makers.
alive the year before he dies in 2007. And that's why the MacDowell colony has already started their centennial celebrations. They incorporated, and he was aware that this legacy was going to be put in motion. And that has to have been fulfilling because he was an educator and he wanted to nurture the younger generation of American musicians. But there was very little support for it.
I think Liszt was generous in that way too. I do think ultimately
playing living.
Liszt was interested in bringing out the other talents. In the end, I think he was. But I have a question for you: who were the American colleagues of MacDowell?
There's a man, George Templeton Strong, who was a friend of his when they're 17, 18, and they would go on these long alpine hikes with walking sticks. There's some
like Mahler and Strauss.
Yeah, well, or like Liszt, that whole period when, with the Comtesse d'Agoult, and they walked through the Alps, the great cycle, the Année de Pèlerinage, the years of my wanderings. Wonderful pieces.
Wandering is something that the Romantics did.
They're getting away from the rent.
Right.
And diapers.
So what about Amy Beach? How does she figure in this whole world?
She becomes very good friends with Marion MacDowell, and she goes to the MacDowell colony, I think, like 13 times. She was an ace pool player, and in the main hall, which is the main building when you drive up and you go in and you're told which cottage you're going to be assigned to. And they all have very pictorial names. Louise Talma, my lady composer I so admired and recorded her music, I would visit her every fall. And when she died, she left $1 million to the MacDowell colony. It was from the sale of her Central Park West apartment, but still, she loved that place. And I have never heard of anybody, they're called colonists, who go there, saying a bad word about it, because what it buys you is time. Your food is delivered in a little basket. If you want to come out and play pool or take a walk or meet other colonists, that happens up at the main house. But privacy and quietude, because you're under some deadline, and then the MacDowell gives you 3 weeks, 2 months, private time. And your family is really not encouraged to visit, and there are no dogs. It's just, they're, like 300 acres up there.
And MacDowell, that's how he liked it. He didn't like New York City and the bustle and when he lived here in Boston, he used to take walks in the public garden, I'm sure. Well, do you have some Amy Beach that we might hear?
I think that Beach and MacDowell would have met, but she's off pursuing her career in 1906 and 7 and 8. She's in Europe, and it's after she comes back and poor Edward has died that she then forms a very deep friendship with Marion, and she also left a great deal of money to the MacDowell colony.
Oh, interesting. So what do you have?
I brought you a little flower piece.
Okay. That's in keeping?
It's called Heartsease. It's from her set Grandmother's Garden.
Heartsease is by the composer Amy Beach from New Hampshire, and Virginia Eskin is playing for us today. That's music by Amy Beach. Heartsease, named after that flower. And we've really been diving into these natural outpourings from these romantic composers, but especially we're talking about the American composer Edward MacDowell. Virginia Eskin is playing the piano today and talking to us about MacDowell. Virginia, I was reading about some essays. There is quite a bit written that MacDowell set down, things that he really felt strongly about. And I found something I wanted to ask you about, because I don't quite understand what he's getting at here, and I'm not sure if he's being sarcastic or not. He says, many colleges and universities of America consider music as a kind of boutonnière. Low as it is, there is a possibility of building on such an estimate. Could such persons be made to recognize the existence of decidedly unpleasant music, it would be the first step toward a proper appreciation of the art and its various phases. I guess when I first read that, I thought he was promoting the idea of unpleasant music, but then I realized perhaps what he's trying to say is people just need to understand the possibilities of music, you think? What is he getting at there?
That's interesting. I have read that quote. What's happening is noise is starting to be heard by people from the Industrial Revolution. And noise music, of course, is going to take over. And he was asked about ragtime. And he said, I really don't care for it. But then he was quick to add, but I did put some in the second movement of my concerto. Well, I dove into that because, I love ragtime. And I was looking for what he considered ragtime. I guess there's some syncopation.
It's hard to find.
Yeah, and it's that piece is very charming. That movement sounds, like two Chip and Dale running around the snow or something. It's not exactly saloon music.
Not right.
I think there was a conductor in New York who organized a huge tying in with the Eiffel Tower, and they were called the Americans in Paris, and it was the Exposition Universelle. And it was touting, steam engine trains. And, of course, Europe was the epicenter of all the machinery, and England was building these incredible locomotives. It takes us a while to catch up. And they sent a delegation of American musicians, and they asked MacDowell to be the main soloist. And he dragged his heels. He said, it's like putting monkeys, on view and making them play the piano and dress up in a tuxedo.
Right.
He didn't like it. He felt that these Americans were going to be trotted out in defense. And a French critic, after he heard one of those concerts, said, I am just amazed. I thought Americans were busy slaughtering Indians. It said that in this review. So what you have is this is like 1894 or something.
Wow.
The concept of Americans composing music, living in parlors, behaving like educated humans, escaped a lot of Europeans. Because they heard, of course, about what he had done to the Indians. That was fact. But we weren't all busy killing Indians here.
Right.
If you look at America in 1890, there's a lot of culture, and maybe it's mainly on the East Coast, but it's filtering. You have the great expansion west. The railroads are going through Montana. So he was very bitter about that. MacDowell felt that there was not the kind of reception back in this country. And of course, he was right. Orchestras like New York and Boston, they were very busy playing Bruckner and Mahler and Brahms. And was token little crumbs that were thrown to Americans. And I have to say that situation is changing. You have to find a conductor if you're a pianist, or you have to find an orchestra and management that will let you run with whatever is the new music of the day and let you take a chance with it. And the irony is that we take a chance with art. We go into a museum and we look at amazing things that have just been done last week. But when it comes to music, we hold it to a very, very different paradigm of what's allowed, what's good. And the main thing that really changed, though, is the rise of jazz. And then you have composers like Ives, Ruggles, Copland, Lunig, all those people who are going to sample it and run it through. And then comes a whole second wave of people like Barber and David Diamond and all those composers who are coming out of the 50s and 60s. And then eventually you have Carter and Babbitt, who completely turn everything that was sort of going towards tonality upside down.
So MacDowell then fits naturally into this line that you're describing.
Yes.
MacDowell played a part in getting us toward the David Diamonds and through the jazz age and into the Carter age.
Absolutely. He's the midwife, in a sense. Some people would argue that his greatest achievement is the Colony. There's no other composer
who did that.
That's a gift.
Right.
That is a laboratory for creativity.
Sure, that makes good sense.
There's there's Edna St. Vincent Millay Colony. There are a few of them in our country. And the fact that it's in this incredible bucolic setting, which you have, I love the way you've understood that. He's a poetic person. He's a gentle soul, and it's very easy to diss him and overlook him. It's like picking up a wild rose. It only has 4 petals. But it's the genus of the great rose. It was hybridized, and now you buy a rose and it has 50 petals.
Right.
It had to start somewhere.
Right.
And MacDowell loved our American indigenous wildflowers. And he's very green, Al Gore. He's really, he's of this environmentally correct age.
The probably most famous little thing that he wrote is To a Wild Rose. Have you done something to that?
I'll lay it at your feet.
Okay, lay it at our feet. Virginia Eskin is with us as we mark the 100th anniversary of the death of Edward MacDowell. Virginia Eskin cannot help but to break into a rag. That's where she is. And that, of course, from To a Wild Rose by Edward MacDowell, transformed for us today on our Steinway here in our Fraser Performance Studio into a rag. Do you call it To a Wild Rose rag? Is that what you call that? Or
I usually just play it as an encore. Yeah. It has no name.
The unnamed rag.
But I got the idea from Paul Whiteman because, that famous concert when Rhapsody in Blue was the sleeper, the Aeolian Hall concert in 1924. And Paul Whiteman loved Victor Herbert and he loved MacDowell. And his jazz band played To a Wild Rose.
Well, we hope that people will explore further the artistry and the output of Edward MacDowell. And we're so grateful to you for coming and bringing us so intimately to his attention. Thank you, Virginia Eskin.
Thank you, Cathy.
Thanks also today to Jim Donahue, who is our sound engineer. Our director of live performances and producer is Alan McClellan. Our production assistant is Cameron Kirkpatrick. I'm Cathy